Accepting refugees, including those from Syria today, is not only inhumane, it is also counterproductive. By counterproductive, I mean it makes things worse for the Syrian refugees and it makes things worse for the countries accepting them. My logic is based on the following 7 key points. Number 1. Only a fraction of the refugees arriving in Europe are Syrian refugees. Point number 2, by accepting the arrivals, we are exclusively helping the relatively rich refugees. Number 3, this is done at the expense of the truly poor and vulnerable refugees. Number 4, by accepting refugees, we are enabling a ruthless billion-dollar human smuggling business. Number 5, accepting refugees pushes people to make dangerous journeys to get to Europe. Number 6, refugees are a huge burden on the accepting nations. Number 7, accepting refugees makes us more likely in the future to go to war. So point number 1, the asylum seekers in Europe are not all Syrian refugees. In fact, only about 21% are actually from Syria, according to the EU Statistical Office Eurostat. And of those 21%, an unknown amount have fake Syrian passports, as reported by the BBC, The Guardian and The Telegraph. Accepting refugees is therefore misguided and fuels a fake passport commerce. In other words, we do not know exactly how many people seeking asylum in Europe are actually from Syria, but we do know it is less than 25% for sure. These numbers should not be confused with those on the total number of people crossing the Mediterranean Sea, where about half are indeed Syrians. Possibly less, though, if they have obtained fake Syrian passports. Interestingly, Germany will be sending Afghani refugees back to Afghanistan, despite the fact that Afghanistan is at war. For reasons unknown, Germany is now cherry-picking which refugees they will accept. Nonetheless, Syrians are accepted despite reporting from The Guardian that fake Syrian passports can be bought at the mere cost of 5,000 euros, which brings me to the second argument. Number 2, by accepting Syrian refugees, we help only the relatively rich Syrians. We are not helping those most in need, and instead we actually make things worse for the most vulnerable of refugees. We all agree that any humanitarian mission worthy of its name should be helping people in the most crucial situation after fleeing Syria's civil and proxy war. The poorest and most vulnerable Syrian refugees are those without money for food or to survive. But we know that the people arriving in Europe have spent substantial amounts of money in order to get here, so they are obviously not the poorest of refugees. The mentioned fake passports for thousands of dollars is one thing. In addition, The Economist calculated the cost for reaching Europe from the Middle East and Africa, and it amounts to several thousands of dollars, same as has been reported in The Telegraph. By accepting refugees in Europe, we are leaving the poorest behind in Syria and the refugee camps, while accepting what Germany calls middle-class refugees. The poorest refugees are too poor to leave for Europe, as reported by the Washington Post and US News. And here is where things get truly un-humanitarian and counterproductive. It is a fact that European nations have been forced to reduce the money they give to international aid programs that would help the poorest of refugees that cannot afford to come to Europe. Instead, money is used on domestic immigrants in European nations, meaning that the poorest are now even poorer because of our policy of accepting refugees. Which brings me to point number 3. The foreign aid budget is diverted to paying for domestic immigrants. For example, the United Kingdom. Recently, George Osborne, the politician responsible for economic and financial matters in Britain, explained that he would do just that, take money from the foreign aid budget and instead use it on refugees that have arrived in Britain. Keep in mind that there are about 4 million refugees in the refugee camps and that Britain has accepted less than 6,000 of these Syrians. The end result is that far fewer Syrians are helped by this policy because it is so much more expensive to accept refugees than to help people on site in the refugee camps. The Star Tribune suggests this will make the situation worse for refugees, ultimately causing more people to flee and attempt to reach Europe. This is what I mean when I say that accepting refugees is counterproductive. The goal is supposedly to help refugees, but actually money to the most vulnerable of refugees has to be reduced, which makes things worse for the majority of refugees, which in turn causes more refugees to seek entry into Europe, thus exacerbating the refugee problem. Since foreign aid not only goes to Syria but also the poor in Africa, Latin America and Asia, the repercussions are therefore global. The Independent points out that reduced overseas aid yields more instability and subsequent increases in refugee flows, not only from Syria but the entire world. It is therefore obvious that accepting immigrants is counterproductive, as it is costly and causes compensatory reductions in the foreign aid budget, meaning we will help fewer people for the money we have. Before we move on to the next point, I would like to stress that this is not a rhetorical trick of either or, where we could supposedly do both. It should be clear from the articles that we cannot do both, otherwise we would not have to take money from the foreign aid budget and use it domestically. It essentially boils down to the question, should we accept a relative handful of immigrants and give them a life of relative luxury in Europe, or should we make sure that actual Syrian refugees, women, children and men, have food for the day, every day? And this is a serious question. The World Food Programme states that they are struggling to feed the roughly 5 million Syrians that are displaced because they are severely underfunded. The World Food Programme gets most of its funding from government sources, and obviously if countries like the United Kingdom are cutting their foreign aid, then this has very real and negative effects. The Guardian also reported that the World Food Programme had to stop 1/3 of its food voucher program for Syrians, including over 200,000 Syrians who have not received food since September. The World Food Programme would have needed $236 million to remain operational for another month, but were unable to get donors. This in a situation where the UK alone gives over $15 billion per year in foreign aid. Countries like the UK have, however, chosen to use an unspecified portion of their foreign aid money on 6,000 Syrians in the UK, rather than the starving hundreds of thousands in the refugee camps. And that is only Syria. On a global perspective, the World Food Programme has estimated that roughly 10% of the global population is going hungry, meaning about 800 million people worldwide. Their definitions are important, explaining that 25% of all children globally have reduced growth due to lack of food, and how lack of micronutrients is affecting about 2 billion people worldwide. Similar numbers are given by the World Bank, who estimates that about 10% of the global population has less than $2 per day to survive on. If the rich countries now start to make cuts in their foreign aid budgets, then people could literally start starving to death. The BBC reports that things are getting so bad in the Jordan refugee camps that some Syrian refugees are returning to Syria despite the war, Assad and ISIS, because they have been forced to live below the Jordanian poverty line of about $3 per day, and they cannot stand it. I argue that this is unhumanitarian and counterproductive on so many levels. Another example is SIDA, the Swedish agency working for reducing poverty in the world. SIDA gets their money from the Swedish government at about $4.5 billion per year. However, deductions for, among other things, the costs of accepting immigrants in Sweden are made. Sweden is permanently settling a huge number of immigrants per capita, estimated to reach 190,000 people in 2015 alone. Consider that the country only has 9.5 million people, and consider that the UK only accepted a few thousand. The consequences for the Swedish foreign aid is therefore predictable. SIDA has been informed that they might face a 50% reduction in their budget, which could mean that 1 million people will lose their humanitarian support because of the costs of accepting refugees. SIDA has provided a detailed description of what such a cut would mean. Among other things, 150,000 children won't get treated for malnourishment anymore, 1 million people will not get clean water, 50,000 boys and girls will not go to school, meaning long-term detrimental effects. Areas like Afghanistan, South Sudan, Colombia, Palestine, and even the LGBT community in Russia will all experience cuts. The final example is Australia, who also had to cut their foreign aid budget in 2012 to deal with both immigrants coming to their country. This means that we will help a small fraction of the 60 million refugees globally by accepting those few refugees, while at the same time we are forced to not help the remaining majority because we cannot do both, so it is a bona fide either-or scenario. Point number 4. By accepting refugees, we are enabling a human smuggling and trafficking business. The smugglers earn millions of dollars, according to Wall Street Journal and Al Jazeera. The most comprehensive reporting, however, I found from Der Spiegel, confirming that people pay several thousands of dollars to reach Europe and that the smugglers have earned an estimated 16 billion euros over the past 15 years, meaning more than 1 billion euros per year. The article describes the costs for going from Turkey across the Mediterranean Sea to Greece and several thousands needed to get to Germany from there. Or you can just pay $15,000 and fly there with falsified papers directly. Individual smugglers can earn millions and drive around in luxury cars, as seen by documents obtained after their networks were arrested. The United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime reported in 2010 that smuggler gangs smuggled 55,000 individuals from Africa to Europe in 2008 and earned about 150 million US dollars in doing that. That means roughly 2,700 US dollars per person, which fits with current estimates. Today, with at least 10 times more people being smuggled, we can calculate that the gangs will make somewhere between $1 and $2 billion on this business per year, which again fits with Der Spiegel's reporting. By accepting immigrants, Europe is enabling the smuggling business to continue. The smugglers are not good people that want to help others get into Europe. I am happy to say that at least one politician seems to have realized this and is talking about it to the Financial Times. The Austrian politician Sebastian Kurz recently said that Austria is indirectly running a people smugglers promotion program by allowing people to enter and settle in Austria. Particularly worrying, however, is the reporting on these smugglers. The smugglers are sometimes portrayed as pioneers and given the opportunity to defend their so-called business of smuggling. On closer inspection, these gangs are, however, seasoned criminals experienced in drug and human trafficking as well as money laundering and sexual exploitation. The Guardian reports of smugglers abandoning their clients to die in the desert of thirst. Others are kidnapped and used as slaves for months until they can pay their way out. Occurrence of rape is established, but other than that, reporters are not allowed to enter the warehouses where the refugees are stored, where of course anything can occur. So-called economic migrants from parts of Africa that isn't at war describe how they have to suffer during the voyage, some of them being beaten to death or tortured by their smugglers. Europe is effectively enabling this business by accepting smuggled refugees. If Europe had instead categorically refused to accept any refugees, then the situation would have looked like it did for Australia in 2014. At a peak, Australia had 20,000 refugees arriving in 2013 by boat, after which they initiated Operation Sovereign Borders and announced that no unauthorized arrivals by boat would be allowed to settle in Australia.
It is the policy and practice of the Australian Government to intercept any vessel that is seeking to illegally enter Australia and safely remove it beyond our waters. If you travel by boat without a visa, you will not make Australia home. The rules apply to everyone: families, children, unaccompanied children, educated and skilled. There are no exceptions. Do not believe the lies of people smugglers. These criminals will steal your money and place your life and the life of your family at risk for nothing. The message is simple. If you come to Australia illegally by boat, there is no way you will ever make Australia home.
They have had no boats since 2014 in August and recently celebrated 1 year without boats, which means they killed off the smuggling business and no longer have to cut their foreign aid budget to spend more money on unauthorized arrivals. And Europe can do the same. You might argue, however, that Australia did not solve the problem of people being smuggled, but only pushed it to other nations. And this is a perfect argument for why every nation in the whole world should adapt the same laws. If the settling of smuggled people were illegal in every country in the whole world, then there would be no smuggling business. Point number 5. Accepting refugees creates a pull factor for people to cross the dangerous Mediterranean Sea. This has been repeatedly articulated by the United Kingdom government. The fact that accepting people crossing the Mediterranean Sea will incentivize more people to cross. Proponents of rescue missions and accepting refugees are of course not advocating this out of sheer evil, but they are misled by the superficial and short-term effects and are disregarding the long-term effects. Not doing anything, of course, would be bad, which is precisely why Europe should have announced, like Australia did, that there was no way that a single person arriving by boat in Australia would be allowed to settle. What is particularly worrying, however, is the response to the photo of the drowned boy Aylan Kurdi, which I will not show here. The response has been, since the child died trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea, we now have to accept every refugee. Again, there are unintended negative consequences in doing so. If we only look to Australia, we will see them and avoid them.
From now on, instead of simply trying to turn boats out of Australian waters, the Navy would board them and sail them all the way back to Indonesia. Word quickly spread that the game had changed. For the refugees, if there was no way back, they too had to take up new tactics and force a way through.
Many people heard when we was in Indonesia, and they say we have to throw the children because both before they do it, they throw children to the water, and the Navy accept them.
My dad got me because they wouldn't let us to go to Australia, so he's like, oh, let's make a joke so they can take us to it. He got me and he's like, we're gonna throw our children in the water if you don't take us.
I'm just my daughter, like move, just inside.
He picked me up and acted like he was gonna throw me in the water.
And I said, Muhammad, my daughter, leave her, she's died.
But police very quickly
catch him.
Catch me, yeah.
This way we want to scare the Navy. We do that.
Let the reality of that clip sink in for a while and then acknowledge that reality and the unintended consequences of our actions. Consequences that, however, are fully obvious if you analyze the issue without emotion and on the basis of logic, science, and history. If the goal is to help as many people as possible and endanger as few people as possible, then saying no is the only solution. Helping in the affected areas is far more effective and allows you to help far more people for the same amount of money as accepting only a few would. I have furthermore posted a video of my solution to the refugee crisis, which is creating a refugee nation in the empty cities of Egypt, which you can watch by clicking here. In this video, we have now reached an important milestone. Before I address whether or not accepting refugees is detrimental to the European economy or society, we must first acknowledge that my arguments 1 to 5 categorically expose the accepting of refugees as un-humanitarian and counterproductive, for the reasons I have stated. Number 1, a minority of the people arriving are refugees from Syria, while de facto refugees from Afghanistan are being sent back for some reason. Point number 2, only relatively wealthy people are arriving and not the poorest. Number 3, foreign aid is reduced in favor of domestic immigrants, meaning that the poorest suffer even more and more people become refugees globally. Number 4, we enable the business of human smugglers that commonly sexually exploit their clients or leave them to die in the desert. Number 5, we are creating a pull factor for people to cross the Mediterranean Sea, which is dangerous. I will now address very briefly the final 6th and 7th point of whether or not Europe benefits from hundreds of thousands or even millions of unknown people crossing into our borders. I will make a longer video about this and how it is not beneficial, but I will keep it very brief here. But even if accepting refugees was beneficial for the economy of the host nation, we can no longer pretend that accepting refugees is humanitarian or responsible, or actually helping refugees. Any argument in favor of accepting refugees is therefore presented in full knowledge of the detrimental effects, and if indeed accepting refugees can be beneficial for the European economy, then arguing for the accepting of refugees is done not on humanitarian grounds, but on selfish grounds. So point number 6, refugees are bad news for the European countries. Often we are told that immigrants are a profit for the economy of the accepting nations. This is, however, a myth that needs to be dealt with resolutely. Simply arguing that accepting refugees is good for the economy is so obviously false that one wonders how people have reached this conclusion. Let us start with pure logic before we get into the studies. So ask yourself, if accepting refugees is a benefit for the economy, then why are countries so against accepting refugees? Turkey's Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu explained in September 2015 that Turkey had spent £3.9 billion on accepting Syrian refugees. Obviously, this is a huge cost partly due to the funding of refugee centers, providing them with food and blankets and so on. It is therefore obvious that accepting refugees has not been beneficial for the Turkish economy. You might argue that there are long-term benefits for Turkey, but the Turks would disagree, as they hope to establish a safe zone in Syria so that they can get rid of 2 million refugees in the future. Financial Times reported that the German finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble announced that Germany would pay around 20 billion euros or 0.6% of their GDP for the estimated 800,000 refugees arriving in 2015, and similar numbers have been provided by The Guardian, settling the cost for German taxpayers at 12,000 euros per year per immigrant. The article goes on clearly to state that Germany has no idea of whether or not the people arriving are highly skilled or lowly skilled, but that they will nonetheless somehow contribute to the economy because of increased labor supply. And this claim flies in the face of youth unemployment data from the OECD. The OECD shows that the EU average of youth unemployment is 23.5%. For Germany it is 7.8%, and for Sweden it is 23.6%. For the countries where immigrants arrive first, it is 40% in Italy and 58.3% youth unemployment in Greece, meaning there is plenty of labor supply in the EU already. And I have also gone over the huge cost of accepting refugees in point number 3. The cost is so large that the UK, Australia and Sweden need to cut their foreign aid budget and divert money to the refugees arriving in their nation. Again, obviously, accepting refugees is the opposite of a profit for their economy. So when people are confronted with these realities, the argument usually changes, becomes a bit more nuanced. No longer are refugees a profit for the economy by default, but they can be a profit for the economy in the long term in certain countries. Again, I will be very brief on this point, but the proper way to discuss immigration involves acknowledging a few truths. The reality is that immigration can be of great value to nations, but we have to separate the immigration of highly skilled individuals, such as researchers and doctors. On the other hand, the immigration of poor, uneducated, sometimes illiterate people. Even when we do so, it is not actually clear who contributes to the economy and who doesn't. The Telegraph reports a study that shows that in order to be a net contributor through taxes to the economy, you need to earn an annual salary of between 35 to 38,000 pounds per year. For the UK, this means that the top 40% of households carry the burden, while the bottom 60% are net beneficiaries of the UK welfare system, as they take more in benefits than they contribute in taxes. This is probably why so many countries are against accepting refugees, and would explain why the UK is demanding that you earn at least 35,000 pounds per year, even if you're working in the hospital, otherwise you cannot stay in the UK long term. At the same time, we know that the immigrants in the UK are overrepresented in areas such as farming, construction work, food services. These are generally low-wage jobs. The Mirror reports wages from the Office of National Statistics, and this shows that this kind of work, which immigrants are overrepresented in, hardly exceeds 35,000 pounds per year. To exceed the threshold of contributing to the economy, you need in general to be educated and highly skilled, again, which some immigrants are in the UK. This again points to the crucial point of separating highly skilled immigrants from the non-educated immigrants, many of whom are refugees that don't speak English, are illiterate, and sometimes bring their whole families. And this is only the economic side. Another reason for why countries like the UK are reluctant to accept refugees is the risk of accepting infiltrating Islamists, Al-Qaeda and ISIS fighters. Even the Pope has acknowledged this risk, and it has already happened. One of the people responsible for the attack on the Bardo Museum in Tunisia, in which 21 tourists were killed, had illegally taken the boat into Italy in February before he was arrested. If that wasn't enough, the FBI recently apprehended a Russian gang member that sought to sell nuclear material to ISIS, allegedly for 2.5 million euros. He wanted to sell cesium, a highly radioactive compound that makes the whole city uninhabitable due to radiation that lasts for years if someone blows up a cesium bomb. The US Department of Homeland Security provides a PDF on the threat of ISIS fighters from Europe that returned to the Western countries after fighting in Syria and Iraq. In September of 2015, roughly 25,000 foreign fighters have joined the Islamist jihadists, and 4,500 of them come from the West. The top 10 Countries providing these foreign fighters include France, Germany and the UK. ISIS-linked terror plots by people returning to the Western nations have estimated to be around a dozen, with a total of 60 globally from ISIS-trained fighters. The EU's counter-terrorism coordinator, Kerkhofe, claims that at least 3,000 EU citizens were fighting in Syria as of September, claiming that a major Islamist terrorist attack in Europe is all but inevitable and that over 100 jihadist fighters had returned to France alone. Most likely with very little effort, since Europe is allowing anyone to enter its borders without discrimination. What such an attack on European soil would look like is anyone's guess, but if ISIS is truly trying to obtain nuclear material, then the situation is very serious. Accepting refugees is therefore not only bad for the economy, it's also a huge risk for Europe. Number 7. Accepting refugees makes us more likely to go to war. This seems to be a point that fully has escaped mainstream and conservative discourse. It is said that European nations are aging societies, meaning that people live longer and have fewer kids. The misconceptions on this matter will be dealt with in a different video, but let's say that this is fully correct and that accepting young refugees would therefore be a benefit for example, Germany's aging population. The main problem is that accepting refugees is just no solution to the problem. It merely pushes the problem forward in time and makes the problem bigger. You see, immigrants also grow older and retire. Immigrants also, with time, have fewer children. So this is hardly a solution, but we have managed to make the aging problem bigger for the next generation, so that the next generation will also have to rely on massive refugee flows to maintain their future economy. What this means is that global geopolitical stability is now a threat to the European economy, because if there are no wars, then there are no refugees, and then there is no solution to the future aging population problem. And this has very real consequences for whether or not a nation decides to go to war. Going to war is a cost-benefit analysis. On the pro side, you might remove a tyrannical dictator like Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. You might open up new markets and possibly spread Western values and liberate people. On the con side, it is very costly and it is very difficult, as we see in Iraq and Libya. A lot of civilians will die, and it can make your country very unpopular, as we see with the United States of America. So naturally, nations are reluctant to go to war. We have seen this with North Korea and recently also with Syria. If, however, in this balance you add the parameter of saving your aging economy, then that weighs very heavily on the pro side of going to war. If accepting immigrants is portrayed as the only solution to the aging society problem, and if multiculturalism is sold as something by default positive, then naturally Europe will see the benefits of going to war. If the reality of the situation, if the 7 points that I have brought up were considered seriously, and if European nations clearly proclaimed that Germans and Swedes and French need to have more children on their own, without being accused of being racists or protectionists, then going to war would be much less popular and would weigh very heavily on the con side. However, the opposite is true. This clip shows the former Swedish finance minister Anders Borg essentially acknowledging my point number 7.
Sweden is now, in absolute terms, the country that has most immigrants in Europe. In absolute terms, we are receiving as many people as France, England and Germany. And Sweden is around 10 million and France and the UK and the others are among 50, 60, 70 million. Basically, the US is providing these flows for us. You make war and we get the refugees. So the largest ethnic minority in Sweden now is the Iraqis, which is the largest group. We have a very large Iranian group, a large Somali group, quite a large Afghanistani group. And we think that this is basically an asset for the Swedish society.
Please comment on these points I have brought up if you find errors or if you have something to say.